People only notice the girl on the floor when someone powerful finally looks down. The ballroom of Blackthorn Manor glowed beneath 3 enormous crystal chandeliers imported from Paris 20 years earlier by a duke who believed beauty should intimidate people before conversation ever could. Candlelight shimmered across polished marble floors so smooth they reflected the movements of London society like water under moonlight. Silk gowns swept across the room in soft waves of ivory, gold, and pale blue. Diamonds flashed at elegant throats. Laughter drifted through the orchestra music in carefully measured bursts. Everything inside the grand hall had been designed to remind guests exactly who mattered and who did not. Serafina Vale knelt on the marble floor beside the eastern staircase with a bucket of water at her side, and a folded cloth clenched tightly between her pale fingers. No one looked at her directly. That was the first lesson servants learned at Blackthorn Manor. A good maid was part of the furniture. Useful. Silent. Forgettable. Her sleeves were rolled carefully to her elbows. A thin layer of soap water dampened the cuffs of her gray uniform. The marble beneath her hand still carried traces of mud from the arriving carriages despite the fact that she had already scrubbed the entrance twice that evening. Another line of guests had arrived 10 minutes earlier. Another trail of dirt had followed. Another reminder that some people existed only to clean what others ruined without thought. Serafina lowered her eyes as a group of aristocratic women passed near the staircase. Perfume drifted through the air behind them. Expensive perfume. Sweet and cold at the same time. One of the women glanced downward for less than a second before looking away again. Honestly, the woman murmured quietly to her companion, though not quietly enough. Why do they keep servants crawling around during a ball? Her friend laughed softly behind an ivory fan. Because somebody must clean after the rest of us. The two women continued walking without another glance. Serafina kept scrubbing. Her movements never changed. Slow circles. Steady pressure. Quiet breathing. She had learned years ago that humiliation became easier to survive once it stopped surprising you. The orchestra shifted into another waltz. Violins floated through the ballroom with polished elegance, while noblemen guided their partners across the dance floor beneath golden candlelight. Serafina watched none of it. Looking too long at beautiful things only made the rest of life harder to endure afterward. Somewhere above her, near the second-floor balcony overlooking the ballroom, a deep male voice spoke quietly to another gentleman. The sound barely carried through the music, but the room subtly changed around it. Conversations softened. Servants straightened. Even laughter seemed to pause before continuing more carefully than before. The Duke had entered the ballroom. Serafina did not look up immediately. Servants were not supposed to stare at nobility, especially not at Adrian Blackthorn. She had worked at Blackthorn Manor for nearly 14 months and had never once exchanged more than 3 words with him directly. Yet she knew the sound of his footsteps better than she knew the church bells in the village below the estate. Everyone did. Duke Adrian Blackthorn moved through rooms like a storm crossing open water. Quiet. Controlled. Dangerous without needing to announce itself. At 34, he ruled not only Blackthorn Manor but nearly half the surrounding county through old money, political influence, and the kind of reputation that caused people to lower their voices instinctively when speaking his name. Some called him cold. Others called him brilliant. Most simply feared him enough not to discuss him openly. Serafina dipped her cloth back into the water bucket and continued cleaning. She could feel eyes moving across the ballroom above her. Not the wandering attention of guests. Something heavier. Focused. Intentional. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth before relaxing again. Do not imagine things, she told herself silently. Then it happened. Lord Percival Ashdown stumbled backward during conversation near the staircase after laughing too loudly at his own joke. His polished shoe landed directly across Serafina's right hand. Pain flashed sharply through her fingers. The bucket beside her tipped slightly, sending water across the marble. A few nearby guests stepped back immediately to avoid the spill. Lord Ashdown looked down at her at last. Tall. Red-faced from too much champagne. Annoyed rather than apologetic. Watch what you are doing, he snapped. Serafina pulled her injured hand back quietly. I am sorry, my lord. Sorry does not remove water from Italian marble. His irritation grew louder now that several nearby guests had begun watching. Good God, girl, were you raised in a barn? A few people laughed politely. Not cruel laughter. Worse. Comfortable laughter. The kind that existed because humiliation had become entertainment. Serafina lowered her head further. No, my lord. Then learn how to stay out of the way. Lord Ashdown stepped aside carelessly. One heel caught the edge of her cloth and dragged it across the wet floor beside her face. More soft laughter followed. Serafina reached for the cloth again without speaking. Her hand trembled once before going still. Above the ballroom, crystal glasses clinked softly somewhere near the balcony. Then silence. Not complete silence. The orchestra continued playing. Guests still moved across the dance floor. But something shifted through the room with sudden invisible force. Serafina felt it before she understood it. Lord Ashdown felt it too. His expression changed first. The color slowly drained from his face. Serafina finally lifted her eyes upward. Duke Adrian Blackthorn stood beside the balcony railing overlooking the ballroom below. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dressed entirely in black formal evening clothes that made his pale skin and sharp gray eyes appear even colder beneath the chandelier light. One crystal glass rested loosely in his right hand. The stem had shattered between his fingers. Dark red wine spread slowly across his knuckles before dripping onto the marble balcony floor beneath him. Nobody spoke. Adrian Blackthorn did not raise his voice. He did not move toward the staircase. He did not defend Serafina publicly. Somehow that made the moment worse. His gaze rested directly on Lord Ashdown. Calm. Expressionless. Absolute. Lord Ashdown swallowed visibly before stepping backward. Your Grace, he said carefully. Adrian said nothing. 1 second passed. Then another. The Duke finally lowered his eyes toward Serafina herself. Not at the bucket beside her. Not at the spilled water. At her. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Serafina felt her pulse stumble painfully inside her chest. She had seen Adrian Blackthorn from a distance many times before. Crossing corridors. Mounting his horse at dawn. Entering the library late at night while servants extinguished candles behind him. But he had never looked directly at her like this. Not openly. Not for this long. His gray eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something. Then he turned away. Just like that. He handed the broken glass silently to a nearby servant and disappeared from the balcony without another word. Conversation returned slowly after several uncomfortable moments. The orchestra continued playing. Guests resumed dancing. Lord Ashdown laughed once, weakly this time, before retreating deeper into the ballroom crowd. Serafina remained kneeling beside the staircase with cold water soaking through her skirts. Her injured hand still burned where the nobleman had stepped on it. Yet none of that frightened her now. What frightened her was the look the Duke had given her before leaving the balcony. It had not been pity. It had not been curiosity. It had looked dangerously close to recognition. By midnight, Blackthorn Manor no longer sounded like music and conversation. It sounded like exhaustion hidden beneath expensive silence. The last carriage had departed nearly 20 minutes earlier. Footmen closed the massive front doors against the cold October wind, while servants moved through the ballroom collecting abandoned champagne glasses and half-melted candles from silver trays. The chandeliers still burned overhead, but their light had softened into something tired now that nobody important remained beneath them. Serafina knelt beside the western wall with a brush in one hand and a folded rag in the other, scrubbing faint wine stains from the marble floor where a countess had dropped her glass earlier in the evening. Her injured hand ached steadily beneath the cloth wrapped around it. She had hidden the swelling from the housekeeper before the ballroom cleanup began. Injuries slowed work. Slow work invited punishment. Across the hall, 2 younger maids whispered while gathering empty plates from the banquet tables. Did you see Lord Ashdown afterward? One asked quietly. He looked like he had seen a ghost. The Duke nearly had him removed. No. If His Grace wanted him removed, he would already be gone. The second girl lowered her voice further. Do you think the Duke noticed her? Serafina kept her eyes lowered to the floor. The first maid glanced briefly toward her before shaking her head. The Duke does not notice servants. Serafina dipped the brush back into cloudy water. That should have comforted her. Instead, unease settled deeper beneath her ribs. Because Adrian Blackthorn had noticed her. She knew it now. She had felt it in the silence upstairs when the ballroom stopped breathing around him. The memory refused to leave her alone. Serafina. The sharp voice cut across the ballroom immediately. Mrs. Whitmore approached from the far corridor with brisk steps and narrowed eyes. The housekeeper wore black silk despite the late hour, her silver hair pinned so tightly it seemed painful. Every servant in Blackthorn Manor feared her more consistently than they feared the Duke himself. Adrian Blackthorn inspired distance. Mrs. Whitmore inspired survival instinct. Serafina rose immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore glanced once at the unfinished floor before handing her a ring of brass keys. "The east wing requires cleaning before morning." Serafina blinked once in surprise before lowering her gaze again. "The east wing, ma'am? I am aware of what I said." Mrs. Whitmore's expression remained perfectly flat. "His Grace has requested it personally." The ballroom suddenly felt colder around Serafina. In 14 months at Blackthorn Manor, she had never once been assigned to the east wing. Most servants had not. The eastern side of the estate remained closed except for a handful of senior staff and the Duke himself. Rumors moved through servant corridors constantly about locked rooms, private libraries, and old family chambers untouched for years. Some said the Duke slept there alone every night surrounded by rooms nobody else entered. Others claimed the wing contained portraits removed from public display after the death of the former Duchess decades earlier. Servants exaggerated everything. Yet nobody laughed when speaking about the East Wing. Mrs. Whitmore studied Serafina carefully. "You will dust the corridors, clean the fireplace in the blue sitting room, and polish the gallery floors. You will touch nothing else." "Yes, ma'am." "You will not open drawers." "No, ma'am." "You will not linger." "No, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore paused for one brief second. "And you will not ask questions." Serafina tightened her fingers carefully around the keys. "I understand." The housekeeper gave a short nod before walking away across the ballroom without another word. Serafina remained standing motionless beside the bucket for several seconds after she left. One of the younger maids stared openly at her now. "The East Wing," the girl whispered. "Why would they send you there?" "I do not know. Nobody gets assigned there." Serafina looked down at the brass keys resting in her palm. Cold metal. Heavy enough to matter. Apparently someone does. 20 minutes later, the ballroom stood empty behind her as she climbed the eastern staircase alone carrying a lantern, a cleaning cloth, and a small bucket of fresh water. The manor had changed after midnight. During the day Blackthorn Estate felt grand and imposing. At night it felt watchful. Endless hallways stretched through darkness beyond the reach of candlelight. Portraits stared from shadowed walls with unreadable expressions. Every floorboard seemed louder after the rest of the house fell silent. Serafina moved carefully through the second-floor corridor until she reached the tall iron gates separating the east wing from the rest of the estate. She unlocked them with trembling fingers. The hinges opened almost soundlessly. That frightened her more than creaking would have. Someone maintained these gates regularly. The corridor beyond smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper. Not dust. Not abandonment. The east wing was lived in. Quietly. The lantern light flickered across dark blue wallpaper and polished oak floors as Serafina stepped farther inside. Tall windows lined the hallway overlooking the northern gardens where moonlight silvered the empty grounds below. No servants moved here. No voices carried through distant rooms. Even the air felt different. Controlled. She passed several closed doors before reaching the blue sitting room mentioned by Mrs. Whitmore. The fireplace inside had already burned low for the night. A single armchair sat near the hearth beside a small table stacked with books and neatly folded newspapers. One crystal whiskey glass rested beside them half full. Still fresh. Serafina stopped moving. The Duke had been here recently. She could feel his presence in the room the way one senses a storm after lightning disappears beyond the horizon. She set down her bucket quietly beside the fireplace and began cleaning. Ash drifted softly against the iron grate, while the lantern cast moving shadows across the walls. Serafina worked slowly, carefully aware of every sound around her. Somewhere deeper inside the east wing, a door closed. Her hand froze briefly against the fireplace stone. Silence followed again almost immediately. She exhaled carefully and returned to work. 10 minutes later, She carried the bucket back into the corridor and continued toward the gallery hall. Moonlight spilled faintly across the polished floors ahead. Portraits lined both walls from floor to ceiling. Generations of blackthorns stared outward through gold frames. Dukes, duchesses, soldiers, women draped in velvet and pearls, children painted beside hunting dogs and garden roses. Serafina walked more slowly now despite herself. Wealth looked different in portraits. Colder somehow. Immortal. Her lantern light moved carefully across another painting before stopping entirely. A young woman stared outward from the canvas wearing pale silver silk and a sapphire necklace resting against her throat. Her hair was light gold. Her eyes gray-blue beneath delicate brows. Serafina's breath caught softly. The woman looked familiar. Not exactly. Not enough to explain the sudden strange tightness in her chest. But something about the face unsettled her immediately. A sound behind her interrupted the thought. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Serafina turned too quickly. The lantern light trembled violently in her hand. Adrian Blackthorne stood at the far end of the gallery corridor dressed entirely in black, one hand resting behind his back as though he had been standing there longer than she realized. His gray eyes moved once from her face to the portrait beside her, then back again. Neither of them spoke. Serafina lowered her gaze immediately. Your Grace. Silence answered first. Heavy silence. Controlled silence. Then Adrian stepped forward once into the lantern glow. Why are you trembling? His voice remained low and calm. Serafina tightened her fingers around the lantern handle. I did not expect anyone awake this late, sir. The Duke studied her for another long moment. That is not what frightened you. Serafina felt her pulse stumble again. She searched carefully for the correct answer and found none. Adrian's gaze shifted slowly toward the portrait beside her. The young blonde woman continued staring outward from the canvas beneath moonlight and lantern glow. Something unreadable crossed the Duke's expression before vanishing again. Finish the gallery, he said quietly. Then lock the east wing behind you. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian Blackthorne turned away without another word and disappeared deeper into the corridor shadows. Serafina remained frozen beside the portrait long after his footsteps vanished completely. Then slowly she looked back toward the painting again. This time her hands trembled harder. Because under the shifting lantern light, the woman in the portrait no longer looked merely familiar. She looked impossible. Serafina did not sleep. Dawn arrived slowly across Blackthorn Manor, turning the frost beyond the servant quarters silver beneath weak October sunlight, but she remained awake in the narrow bed pressed against the far wall of the fourth floor-made corridor. Around her the house stirred back to life piece by piece. Water pipes groaned softly inside the walls. Someone laughed downstairs near the kitchens. Footsteps crossed overhead. Morning always arrived early for servants. Today it arrived like a warning. Serafina stared at the cracked ceiling above her while the portrait from the east wing replayed endlessly in her mind. Pale gold hair. Gray-blue eyes. The shape of the mouth. Even the expression had unsettled her. Calm. Distant. Familiar in a way she could not explain without sounding insane. Polly Mercer, the youngest kitchen maid, rolled over in the neighboring bed and blinked sleepily toward her. You never came back last night. Serafina turned her head slightly. I did. Not until nearly 3 in the morning. Polly pushed herself upright and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Mrs. Whitmore sent you to the east wing, did she not? Serafina hesitated before nodding once. Polly immediately lowered her voice despite the empty room. I heard the Duke keeps half the wing locked because of his family. Servants invent stories when they are bored. That does not mean the stories are false. Serafina sat up slowly, careful with her injured hand. The swelling had darkened slightly overnight. She flexed her fingers once beneath the blanket. Pain answered immediately. Polly noticed. What happened to your hand? Nothing important. It looks painful. Serafina reached for her uniform folded neatly across the chair beside the bed. Pain is usually unimportant in this house. Polly studied her quietly for a moment before speaking again. Did you see him? Serafina stopped moving. Who? The Duke. Silence stretched briefly between them. Polly's curiosity softened into something closer to concern. Everyone says he notices everything. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the dress in her lap. That is exactly what worries me. 40 minutes later, the lower kitchens of Blackthorn Manor roared with the organized chaos of breakfast preparations. Steam clouded the tall windows while servants crossed rapidly between enormous iron stoves carrying trays of bread, silver coffee pots, and stacks of porcelain plates toward the upper dining rooms. Serafina stood near the preparation table polishing serving spoons beneath the sharp supervision of Mrs. Whitmore. The housekeeper moved through the kitchen like a general inspecting troops before battle. Nothing escaped her attention. A crooked napkin invited criticism. A dusty tray invited punishment. Serafina kept her head lowered and her hands steady. That had always been enough before. Today it no longer felt safe. You will accompany breakfast service upstairs, Mrs. Whitmore announced suddenly without looking directly at her. Serafina's hands paused briefly against the silver spoon. Me, ma'am. I do not repeat instructions. Several nearby servants exchanged quick glances immediately. Breakfast service to the upper floors belonged to senior staff only. Serafina usually remained below stairs cleaning hallways or assisting laundry maids. Mrs. Whitmore finally looked at her. The East Wing breakfast tray will be delivered precisely at 8 o'clock. You will carry it yourself. The room around Serafina seemed to narrow slightly. Yes, ma'am. Do not spill anything. No, ma'am. Do not speak unless spoken to. No, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore gave one final sharp nod before turning away toward another servant. Serafina stood motionless beside the preparation table for several seconds after she left. One of the footmen nearby leaned closer once the housekeeper disappeared across the kitchen. What did you do? He whispered. Nothing. Then why are they sending you upstairs? Serafina looked down at the polished silver spoon reflecting distorted kitchen light back at her. I would very much like to know that myself. At exactly 8 o'clock, she climbed the eastern staircase carrying a silver breakfast tray balanced carefully between both hands. Fresh coffee, toasted bread, eggs, blackcurrant preserves. Everything arranged with precise perfection beneath folded linen cloth. The tray was heavier than she expected. Or perhaps her hands were simply less steady today. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall east wing windows as she approached the Duke's private corridor again. The iron gates already stood unlocked. Someone had opened them before her arrival. Serafina stepped carefully inside. The east wing looked different in daylight. Less haunting. More intimate somehow. Dust floated through thin bars of pale sunlight stretching across the oak floors. The portraits lining the gallery walls appeared sharper now beneath morning brightness. More alive. Serafina kept her eyes away from the blonde woman's painting as she passed. She did not trust herself to look again. At the end of the corridor, two massive black doors stood partially open beside a marble fireplace. The Duke's study. Serafina stopped outside the entrance and steadied her breathing once before speaking softly. Your Grace. Breakfast service. No answer came immediately. She remained standing motionless with the tray balanced against trembling fingers. Then Adrian Blackthorn's voice emerged quietly from inside the room. Come in. Serafina stepped through the doorway carefully. The study was enormous. Dark wood shelves climbed nearly 20 feet toward the ceiling filled with leather-bound books and old maps. Morning light spilled across polished floors and heavy navy curtains. A fire still burned low inside the stone fireplace despite the hour. Adrian stood beside the tall eastern windows dressed in a black waistcoat and white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. One hand rested behind his back while the other held several folded documents. He did not look at her immediately. Set the tray there, he said calmly, gesturing toward the long table near the fireplace. Yes, Your Grace. Serafina crossed the room slowly and lowered the tray carefully onto the table. Every movement felt too loud in the silence. She could feel Adrian's presence behind her even before he finally spoke again. Your hand. Serafina froze. Sir. It is injured. She instinctively curled her fingers inward. It is nothing serious. Adrian set the papers aside at last and turned toward her fully. Morning light sharpened the hard lines of his face. Controlled. Unreadable. Dangerous in the same quiet way as the previous evening. His gaze lowered briefly toward the bruising across her knuckles. Lord Ashdown stepped on it. It was not a question. Serafina kept her eyes lowered. Yes, Your Grace. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Thinking silence. Adrian moved toward the table slowly before stopping only a few feet away from her. Serafina became painfully aware of the difference between them then. His height, his stillness, the effortless authority filling the room around him. Can you continue working? He asked. Yes, sir. You answered too quickly. Serafina swallowed once before forcing her voice steady again. I can continue working. Adrian studied her for another long moment. Then unexpectedly he reached toward her injured hand. Serafina stopped breathing. His fingers closed gently around her wrist before she could pull away. Warm, firm, controlled. The Duke lifted her bruised hand slightly toward the sunlight spilling through the windows. Serafina stared at the floor, unable to move. His touch was careful enough to frighten her more than cruelty would have. Adrian's thumb brushed once against the inside of her wrist as he examined the swelling. Then he went perfectly still. The room changed instantly. Serafina felt it before understanding why. Adrian's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. Not enough to hurt. Enough to confirm something. Slowly, very slowly, his gaze lifted from her hand toward her face. Who told you to cover this mark? He asked quietly. Serafina blinked in confusion. Sir. Adrian released her wrist abruptly. A thin section of her sleeve had shifted upward during his inspection. Just above the inside of her wrist, partially hidden beneath fabric, rested a faint birthmark shaped like a crescent intertwined with a small star. Serafina stared down at it. No one, sir. Adrian's expression revealed nothing now. That frightened her most of all. Pull your sleeve down, he said softly. She obeyed immediately. The Duke turned away from her then and walked back toward the windows overlooking the northern gardens. One hand disappeared behind his back again. Controlled. Distant. But something in the room had already changed beyond repair. Serafina could feel it. Adrian spoke without turning around. From this morning forward, you will report directly to the East Wing staff rotation. Her pulse stumbled. Your Grace. Mrs. Whitmore will explain your duties. Sir, I do not understand. Adrian finally looked back at her over one shoulder. His gray eyes appeared colder than before. Colder and infinitely more careful. No, he said quietly. You do not. The entire manor noticed before noon. Servant houses always noticed everything first. Information moved through kitchens and laundry halls faster than it moved through Parliament itself, and by the time the breakfast trays returned downstairs, every maid within Blackthorn Manor knew that Serafina Vale had spent the morning alone inside the Duke's private study. Nobody asked her directly at first. That was not how servants survived. They watched instead. They measured changes carefully the way sailors measured dark clouds gathering over open water. Serafina felt their attention the moment she entered the lower servant corridor carrying the empty silver tray back toward the kitchens. Conversations softened. Footsteps slowed. One scullery maid nearly dropped a stack of folded linens while staring openly at her before quickly lowering her eyes again. Serafina kept walking. Her pulse still had not steadied since leaving the East Wing. Adrian Blackthorn's voice lingered in her mind with dangerous clarity. Pull your sleeve down. No anger. No surprise. Worse than either. Recognition. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the kitchen entrance reviewing inventory notes beside the pantry shelves when Serafina approached. The housekeeper lifted her eyes once toward the empty tray in Serafina's hands. His Grace finished breakfast? Yes, ma'am. Did he give further instructions? Serafina hesitated only briefly. He said I am to report directly to the East Wing staff rotation from today forward. Silence settled immediately between them. Mrs. Whitmore's expression did not change. That alone confirmed the statement had not surprised her. Very well, the housekeeper said calmly. Your belongings will be moved before evening. Serafina blinked once. My belongings? East Wing staff quarters are separate from the main servant floors. Mrs. Whitmore returned her attention to the inventory ledger. You will now sleep upstairs. The tray nearly slipped from Serafina's fingers. Ma'am, I do not understand why this is happening. Understanding is not required. Mrs. Whitmore closed the ledger softly. Obedience is. Serafina lowered her gaze immediately. Yes, ma'am. The older woman studied her for one long moment before speaking again, quieter this time. You are not the first servant His Grace has reassigned unexpectedly. What happened to the others? Mrs. Whitmore's face revealed nothing. They no longer work here. Cold moved slowly through Seraphina's chest. Mrs. Whitmore stepped aside and handed her a folded set of brass keys nearly identical to the ones from the previous night. The blue corridor rooms are now your responsibility. You will clean them personally each morning before 10 o'clock. Seraphina accepted the keys carefully. Yes, ma'am. The Duke's private library remains locked at all times unless instructed otherwise. Understood. The northern gallery is not to be discussed with other servants. Seraphina's fingers tightened around the keys. No, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore paused briefly before adding one final sentence. And if His Grace asks questions, you answer honestly. Seraphina looked up before she could stop herself. The housekeeper had already turned away. By late afternoon, rain drifted steadily against the tall manor windows while servants hurried through corridors preparing Blackthorn Estate for another formal dinner gathering scheduled the following evening. Seraphina spent most of the afternoon cleaning the blue corridor chambers inside the east wing exactly as instructed. The work itself was simple. Dust shelves, polish brass handles, replace candles. Yet tension followed her from room to room like another presence walking silently behind her. Every object inside the east wing seemed deliberate. Nothing appeared accidental here. Not the placement of books beside armchairs. Not the carefully preserved flowers resting inside crystal vases. Not even the portraits watching silently from corridor walls. Especially not those. Seraphina avoided looking directly at the blonde woman's painting throughout the afternoon. She failed repeatedly. Each accidental glance unsettled her more. The resemblance no longer felt imagined. Certain angles of the woman's face mirrored her own too closely now that she had seen them clearly in daylight. The eyes, the pale hair, even the faint shape of the jawline. Impossible similarities. Near 4 o'clock, thunder rolled faintly beyond the northern hills while Seraphina knelt beside the library corridor polishing dark oak floors. Rain tapped steadily against the windows nearby. Somewhere deeper inside the east wing, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Then footsteps approached behind her. Seraphina straightened immediately. Not the Duke this time. A younger man rounded the corridor carrying several leather folders tucked beneath one arm. Tall, blonde-haired, impeccably dressed despite the rain visible through the nearby windows. His sharp blue eyes paused on Seraphina with immediate surprise. You are new upstairs. Seraphina lowered her gaze politely. Yes, sir. The man continued studying her for another moment. Not cruelly. Curiously. Interesting. Seraphina remained silent. He shifted the folders slightly against his arm before speaking again. I am Nathaniel Harrow, the Duke's secretary. Seraphina Vale, sir. Miss Vale. His expression softened faintly. You have caused quite a disturbance downstairs already. Seraphina felt heat rise uncomfortably beneath her skin. I did not intend to. Most people never intend to attract Adrian Blackthorn's attention. Nathaniel glanced once toward the locked library doors nearby. Yet somehow you have managed it in less than 24 hours. Seraphina lowered her cloth back toward the floor. I am only doing my work. Nathaniel smiled slightly at that. Not mocking. Almost sympathetic. That usually changes nothing in this house. Thunder sounded again outside. The secretary's expression faded back toward professionalism as he adjusted the folders beneath his arm. His Grace dislikes unnecessary gossip. My advice would be to avoid listening when servants begin inventing stories about you. And if the stories are true? Nathaniel's eyes rested on her a fraction too long. Then they become dangerous. Before Seraphina could respond, another set of footsteps entered the corridor from the far staircase. Heavier. Slower. Controlled. Nathaniel immediately straightened. Adrian Blackthorn appeared beside the northern windows dressed in a dark charcoal riding coat still damp from rain. Water glistened faintly across one black leather glove. The Duke's gray eyes moved first toward Nathaniel, then toward Seraphina kneeling on the floor beside the corridor wall. His expression revealed nothing at all. The contracts from London arrived this morning, Nathaniel said calmly. Adrian removed one glove slowly without looking away from Serafina. And 3 signatures remain missing. They will not remain missing long. Nathaniel gave a brief nod before extending the leather folders toward him. Adrian accepted them one-handed. Silence followed again. Heavy silence. Nathaniel glanced once between them before clearing his throat softly. I should return downstairs. You should, Adrian agreed. The secretary disappeared quickly toward the staircase. Serafina remained kneeling beside the polished floor long after his footsteps vanished. Adrian Blackthorne stood motionless near the windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens outside. His attention lingered on her lowered sleeve, on the place where the birthmark remained hidden beneath fabric. Stand up, he said quietly. Serafina obeyed immediately. Adrian stepped closer then. Not hurried, not threatening, careful enough to make her heartbeat uneven again. Rain tapped softly against the glass behind him while fading daylight shadowed the corridor around them. Has anyone else seen the mark? He asked. Serafina swallowed once. No, Your Grace. No one. Not that I know of. Adrian studied her face with unsettling focus. You wear long sleeves constantly. Most servants do. Even during summer. Serafina hesitated. My mother preferred it. Something changed behind the Duke's eyes at the mention of her mother. Brief. Sharp. Gone almost immediately. Your mother, he repeated quietly. Yes, sir. Adrian looked away toward the rain outside before asking his next question. Is she alive? Serafina's fingers tightened around the cleaning cloth in her hand. No, Your Grace. Silence returned once more. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he asked, How long ago? 8 months. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly toward the floor between them. And your father? I never knew him. Another silence. Longer this time. Serafina could not understand why these questions frightened her more than anger would have. Adrian finally removed his remaining glove with slow deliberate movements before speaking again. From this point forward, you will keep the mark covered at all times. Sir. No exceptions. His voice remained calm. Absolute. If anyone asks about it, you say nothing. Serafina stared at him now despite herself. Why? Adrian met her gaze fully for the first time since entering the corridor. Storm gray eyes. Controlled and unreadable. Yet beneath that control, something colder moved quietly beneath the surface. Something dangerously close to fear. Because, he said softly, there are people in this world who would recognize it. The corridor suddenly felt very small around her. Serafina's breathing slowed unevenly. Recognize what? Adrian looked at her for one long moment. Then, without answering, he stepped aside and opened the locked library door beside them using a small silver key hidden inside his coat pocket. Warm firelight spilled softly from the dark room beyond. Bookshelves climbed toward the ceiling inside shadows and candlelight. Adrian held the door open without looking at her. Come inside, he said quietly. It is time you saw something. Serafina stepped into the library slowly, unsure whether she had entered a room or a confession. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed louder than thunder. Warm firelight moved across towering bookshelves lined with dark leather volumes and polished brass instruments she could not name. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows overlooking the rain-covered northern gardens. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, old paper, and smoke from the fireplace burning low beside a pair of deep green armchairs. Everything inside the library carried the same impossible stillness as Adrian Blackthorne himself. Ordered. Controlled. Untouched by accident. Serafina remained near the doorway with both hands clasped tightly in front of her. The Duke crossed toward a large oak desk positioned near the center of the room. He removed several folded documents from his coat before setting them aside without looking at her. Come closer, he said quietly. She obeyed. The thick carpet softened her footsteps as she approached the desk. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows behind them. Adrian opened a drawer slowly and withdrew a small object wrapped carefully in dark cloth. Serafina noticed the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly before unfolding it. A silver pendant rested inside. Small. Oval-shaped. Worn smooth with age. Firelight shimmered across the engraved surface as Adrian held it between his fingers. Serafina stopped breathing. Her hand instinctively moved toward the thin chain hidden beneath the collar of her dress. Adrian noticed immediately. His gray eyes lifted toward her face. "Take yours out," he said softly. Serafina hesitated. "Your Grace, Take it out." No anger. No raised voice. Absolute command all the same. Slowly, Serafina reached beneath her collar and pulled free the silver pendant she had worn nearly her entire life. The chain trembled faintly between her fingers. Adrian stepped closer without speaking. Then he placed the pendant from the desk beside hers in the firelight. Identical. The room tilted slightly around her. Serafina stared at the matching silver crests, unable to speak. Same oval shape. Same engraved star intertwined with a crescent moon. Even the scratches along the edges mirrored each other with impossible precision. "No," she whispered before she could stop herself. Adrian watched her carefully. "Your mother gave you that pendant." It was not a question. Serafina nodded slowly. "She said it belonged to my grandmother." "Did she ever tell you where it came from?" No, her voice sounded distant to her own ears now. "She only said I must never lose it." Adrian lowered his gaze briefly toward the pendants resting side by side between them. Smart woman. Silence spread through the library again. The fire crackled softly beside the windows while rain blurred the world outside into silver shadows. Serafina looked back toward the Duke. "Why do you have the same one?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the fireplace and rested one hand against the marble mantel. Firelight sharpened the hard angles of his face while shadows settled beneath his eyes. He looked suddenly older than 34. Tired in a way exhaustion alone could not explain. "Because," he said quietly, "it belonged to someone I once knew." Serafina's fingers tightened around the pendant chain. The woman in the portrait. Adrian's expression changed almost invisibly. A single pause. A breath held too long. "You noticed the resemblance." It was difficult not to. The Duke looked into the fire rather than at her. Her name was Evelyn Ashcombe. Serafina felt cold move slowly through her chest despite the warmth of the room. "Ashcombe." Adrian nodded once. The Ashcombes were one of the oldest noble families in England before most of their estate burned nearly 20 years ago. Burned. Officially. That single word changed the air between them. Serafina understood it immediately. Officially rarely meant truth when spoken by powerful men. Adrian finally turned toward her again. Evelyn Ashcombe disappeared during the fire alongside her husband and infant daughter. Serafina's pulse stumbled unevenly. What happened to them? The Duke held her gaze silently for one long moment. Nobody ever found the child. The library became impossibly quiet. Serafina stared at him while rain struck harder against the windows outside. Somewhere deep inside her chest, instinct began screaming before thought could catch up. Adrian crossed the room slowly until only a few feet separated them again. "How old are you, Serafina?" 23. "Your birthday?" "March 7th. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Not long. Just enough to reveal something dangerously human beneath all his control. When he opened them again, the expression was gone. The Ashcombe child disappeared on March 9th, 23 years ago. Serafina's breathing stopped entirely. "No," the word escaped softly. "Broken." Adrian said nothing. He did not need to. Serafina stepped backward instinctively until the edge of the desk pressed against her spine. "No," she repeated again, louder this time. "That is impossible." "Perhaps. You think I am someone else." "I think," Adrian said carefully, "that too many things no longer resemble coincidence." Serafina shook her head immediately. "My mother was Catherine Vale. She raised me in Thornbridge Village my entire life." "Did she ever speak about your father?" "No." "Did she ever explain the pendant?" "No." "Did she ever tell you why you must hide the birthmark?" Serafina fell silent. Adrian's gaze remained fixed steadily on her face. Not cruel. Not triumphant. Watching. Waiting. "No," she admitted quietly. The Duke moved toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace and withdrew an old leather folder from the upper shelf. Age darkened the edges of the papers inside. He carried it back slowly before placing it across the desk in front of her. "Open it." Serafina stared at the folder without moving. Every instinct told her not to touch it. Some truths changed people permanently once spoken aloud. Adrian waited in complete silence. Finally, with trembling fingers, she opened the worn leather cover. Several yellow documents rested inside beside an old charcoal sketch folded carefully between them. Serafina lifted the sketch first. The room seemed to disappear around her. A woman stared back from the paper. Pale hair pinned elegantly above intelligent gray-blue eyes. Young, beautiful, familiar beyond reason. The resemblance no longer frightened Serafina because resemblance implied distance. This felt closer than that. It felt like looking through time into her own face wearing another woman's life. Her fingers trembled violently against the edges of the sketch. Who drew this? Adrian answered quietly behind her. I did. Serafina looked up sharply. The Duke's expression remained unreadable. You knew her? Yes. How? Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the fire. A long time ago, our families were close. Something in the phrasing felt carefully incomplete. Serafina looked back toward the sketch again. At the bottom corner, written in elegant black ink nearly faded with age, rested two words. Evelyn Ashcombe. Serafina stared at the handwriting while cold spread through every part of her body. Because beneath the name, almost hidden against the edge of the paper, rested the same crescent and star symbol engraved upon her pendant. The same symbol hidden beneath her sleeve. Adrian stepped closer behind her, voice low enough to blend with the rain outside. There are people who believe the Ashcombe bloodline vanished forever. Serafina swallowed unevenly. And if they were wrong? The Duke's gaze lowered toward the birthmark hidden beneath her sleeve. His answer came softly, almost too softly to hear. Then they may come looking for what survived. Rain continued through the night. By morning, Blackthorn Manor stood wrapped in silver fog drifting low across the northern hills and gardens beyond the estate walls. The world outside the manor windows looked softened and distant, as though the storm had washed sharpness from everything except the thoughts inside Serafina's mind. She moved through the east wing corridors carrying fresh linens with steady hands and a quiet face. No one looking at her would have guessed that her entire understanding of herself had begun collapsing less than 12 hours earlier. That frightened her most. The fact that she could continue folding towels and replacing candles while something enormous shifted beneath her life like earth moving beneath thin ice. Servants crossed her path throughout the morning. Some nodded politely. Others stared too long before quickly pretending not to. The rumors had spread farther now. Serafina could feel them moving through the manor around her without hearing the words directly. The Duke's maid. The girl from the East Wing. The servant His Grace noticed. Nathaniel Harrow passed her near the staircase shortly after breakfast carrying another stack of legal documents beneath one arm. His blue eyes paused briefly on her face before lowering toward the covered birthmark, hidden beneath her sleeve. Understanding flickered there immediately. So, he said quietly, he told you something. Serafina tightened her grip on the folded linens. Not enough. Nathaniel gave a faint humorless smile. That is usually how Adrian operates. He glanced once toward the empty corridor before stepping closer. You should be careful. Of what? Everyone. The answer arrived too quickly to be casual. Serafina studied him carefully now. You already knew about the Ashcombes. Nathaniel's expression remained calm. Most old noble families know the name. But not everyone knows about the symbol. Silence answered first. Then Nathaniel lowered his voice further. There are certain stories people stop discussing publicly because wealthy men prefer them buried. Serafina felt cold settle slowly beneath her ribs again. What kind of stories? Nathaniel looked toward the fog-covered windows beside the staircase. The kind involving missing heirs and burned estates. Before she could ask another question, footsteps sounded from the corridor above. Heavy, familiar. Nathaniel immediately straightened. I should go. He disappeared down the staircase moments before Adrian Blackthorn appeared at the upper landing dressed for travel in a dark riding coat and black gloves. Fog drifted faintly behind him through the open entrance doors farther down the corridor. Serafina lowered her gaze automatically. The Duke paused when he saw her. The London guests will arrive tomorrow evening, he said calmly. The East Wing must remain closed during the gathering. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian descended the staircase slowly. Mrs. Whitmore will assign additional duties. Serafina nodded once. Of course. He should have continued walking. Instead, he stopped beside her. Too close. The scent of cold rain and cedarwood lingered faintly against his coat. Serafina kept her eyes lowered toward the folded linens in her arms. Has anyone questioned you? He asked quietly. No, sir. No one. Only curiosity. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Curiosity becomes dangerous very quickly in houses like this. Serafina finally looked up before she could stop herself. Then why tell me any of it at all? Silence stretched between them. The Duke's gray eyes held hers steadily. Controlled on the surface. Something far less controlled underneath. Because you were already beginning to notice. Notice what? Adrian's gaze moved briefly toward the hidden mark beneath her sleeve again. The truth rarely stays buried forever. Then he walked past her without another word. Serafina stood motionless long after he disappeared down the lower corridor. That afternoon, Blackthorn Manor transformed itself for the approaching London guests with the precision of military preparation. Fresh flowers arrived from the southern gardens. Crystal chandeliers were lowered and polished. Extra servants moved through every hallway carrying silver trays and folded linens, while Mrs. Whitmore directed the entire operation with terrifying efficiency. Serafina spent most of the afternoon preparing the blue drawing room inside the east wing according to the Duke's instructions. No guests would enter this section of the manor during the gathering. Adrian had made that unusually clear, which only increased her unease. Why hide the east wing so carefully if nothing dangerous existed there? Near sunset, while replacing candles along the northern gallery, Serafina noticed voices drifting faintly from the adjoining corridor. Male voices. Aristocratic accents. She froze instinctively beside the wall. You should have informed me sooner, one man said sharply. I am informing you now. Adrian's voice remained low and controlled. Serafina could not see them from where she stood, only hear the conversation through the partially open doorway ahead. If the rumors are accurate, the stranger continued, then this becomes significantly more complicated. The rumors are not public. Yet. Silence followed briefly. Then the stranger spoke again, quieter this time. Does she know? Adrian answered immediately. Not enough. And when she does? Another pause. Serafina felt her pulse begin beating harder inside her chest. Then I will deal with it. Something about the calm certainty in Adrian's voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Footsteps shifted beyond the doorway. Serafina moved quickly back toward the candle stand before anyone entered the gallery. Seconds later, a tall older man emerged from the corridor wearing a dark navy coat trimmed with silver embroidery. Sharp green eyes swept across the gallery before stopping directly on her. Serafina lowered her gaze immediately. The man slowed. You. The single word carried cold surprise beneath polished manners. Serafina remained still beside the candle stand. Adrian stepped into the gallery behind the stranger moments later. His expression hardened instantly when he saw where the man's attention rested. Lord Whitmore, Adrian said quietly. The servants are not your concern. Lord Whitmore did not look away from Serafina immediately. Interesting choice of maid. Adrian's voice cooled another degree. That will be enough. The older man finally smiled faintly before adjusting his gloves. Of course. Forgive my curiosity. But the curiosity remained visible in his eyes as he walked away down the corridor. Serafina felt Adrian watching her now. Heavy silence settled through the gallery once more. Who is he? She asked quietly after several seconds. Adrian's gaze remained fixed toward the far corridor where Lord Whitmore had disappeared. A man who notices too much. He looked at me as if he recognized me. That is precisely the problem. Fear moved coldly through her stomach. Adrian stepped closer then, lowering his voice enough that only she could hear it. Listen carefully, Serafina. She looked up at him. Tomorrow night, there will be more guests inside this house than usual. You will remain inside the east wing unless Mrs. Whitmore instructs otherwise. Why? Because certain families still remember the Ashcombe crest. Serafina tightened her fingers around the candle lighter in her hand. And if someone recognizes it? Adrian's expression went completely still. Then everything changes. The gallery suddenly felt colder despite the candlelight burning softly along the walls. Serafina searched his face for reassurance and found none. Only calculation, protection, and beneath both, something darker she could not yet name. Adrian reached toward her then, slowly enough for her to pull away if she wished. His fingers brushed once against the edge of her sleeve where the hidden mark rested beneath fabric. The touch lasted barely a second. Yet Serafina stopped breathing again all the same. "Keep it covered," he said softly. "No matter what happens tomorrow night." Then he turned and walked away through the dim corridor shadows, leaving Serafina standing alone beneath the portraits while fear and something dangerously close to trust tangled together inside her chest. The first carriage arrived just after 6 o'clock. By 7, the long gravel drive leading toward Blackthorn Manor glittered beneath rows of lanterns while noble families stepped from polished black carriages wrapped in velvet cloaks and diamonds bright enough to rival the chandeliers inside the estate. Rain had stopped before sunset, leaving the world outside cold and sharp beneath a clear October sky. Inside the manor, warmth and music swallowed everything else. Servants moved through the halls in perfect rhythm carrying silver trays, crystal glasses, and bottles of imported French wine, while the orchestra prepared inside the ballroom below. Serafina stood alone in the blue corridor fastening the final button at the wrist of her plain gray uniform. Her sleeves remained pulled tightly downward exactly as Adrian instructed. She had repeated his warning silently to herself throughout the entire afternoon. Keep it covered, no matter what happens tomorrow night. Yet unease had followed her relentlessly since morning. The guests arriving downstairs belonged to old noble houses, families who remembered symbols, bloodlines, scandals buried decades earlier, families like Lord Whitmore. A knock sounded softly against her door. Serafina opened it to find Mrs. Whitmore standing outside holding a folded stack of dark navy fabric across both arms. The housekeeper stepped inside immediately without waiting for permission. "Change into this." Serafina blinked once in confusion. The garment resting atop the folded linens was not servant gray. It was a dark navy dress trimmed simply at the collar and wrists with black silk embroidery. Elegant without being extravagant. Too elegant for a maid. "Ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore placed the clothing carefully across the bed. "His Grace has altered the evening assignments." Serafina stared at the dress. "This is not servant attire." "No," the older woman adjusted one cuff calmly. "You will assist inside the upper gallery reception rooms tonight." "The guest level?" "Yes." Serafina felt immediate panic tighten inside her chest. "I have never worked upper reception service." "You will tonight." "Why?" Mrs. Whitmore looked at her directly then. Something almost human flickered briefly beneath the severe discipline of her expression. Concern perhaps. Or pity. "Because His Grace does not wish you downstairs in the ballroom." Serafina understood immediately. Hidden. Again. "Am I being protected?" she asked quietly. The housekeeper's silence lasted too long. "You are being managed." Then she moved toward the door before pausing once more. "Do not remove your gloves this evening." Serafina looked down. A pair of long black gloves rested folded beneath the dress. Her pulse slowed unevenly. Mrs. Whitmore lowered her voice before leaving. "And if Lord Whitmore speaks to you again, you answer only what is necessary." The door closed softly behind her. 30 minutes later, Serafina stood near the upper gallery staircase overlooking the ballroom below, while candlelight shimmered across the polished marble floors beneath her feet. The navy dress fit perfectly despite the fact nobody had ever measured her for it. That realization unsettled her more than the dress itself. Guests drifted through the manor beneath crystal chandeliers and golden candlelight while violins carried softly through the crowded ballroom downstairs. Wealth moved differently than ordinary people. Smoothly. Effortlessly. Every laugh controlled. Every gesture practiced over generations. Serafina remained near the gallery wall holding a silver tray of champagne glasses with careful stillness. Nobody looked closely at servants unless something went wrong. Tonight she prayed for invisibility. It lasted less than an hour. "You are not one of the regular upstairs staff." The voice came from directly beside her. Serafina turned carefully. A woman stood near the gallery railing dressed in deep emerald silk with diamonds glittering across her throat and dark hair swept elegantly above sharp intelligent eyes. Beautiful. Older than Serafina by perhaps 10 years. Dangerous in the effortless way wealthy women often were. "No, my lady," Serafina answered softly. "I was recently reassigned." The woman studied her face openly. "Interesting." Serafina lowered her gaze politely. "May I offer you champagne?" "No," the woman stepped closer instead. "What is your name?" "Serafina Vale." A pause followed. Tiny. Sharp. "Vale," the woman repeated. "And how long have you worked for the Duke?" 14 months, my lady." The woman's expression remained pleasant. Her eyes did not. "You seem unusually calm for someone new to upper service." Before Serafina could answer, another voice interrupted smoothly behind them. "Lady Beaumont, you are interrogating my staff again." Adrian Blackthorne approached across the gallery dressed entirely in black formal evening clothes that made the candlelight appear colder around him. Several nearby guests shifted subtly aside the moment he appeared. The woman smiled faintly. "Only making conversation." Adrian's gaze moved once toward Serafina. Brief. Controlled. "Miss Vale has duties to complete." Lady Beaumont studied the exchange carefully. "Miss Vale," she repeated softly. "How formal." Adrian offered no response. Silence stretched between them for several seconds before Lady Beaumont finally accepted a champagne glass from Serafina's tray. "Very well," she said lightly. "I shall stop terrifying your servants for the evening." Yet her sharp eyes lingered on Serafina another moment before she disappeared down the gallery staircase toward the ballroom below. Adrian remained beside Serafina after the woman left. "Do not speak to Lady Beaumont longer than necessary," he said quietly. "Who is she?" "Someone who notices details for sport." Serafina tightened her fingers carefully around the silver tray. "Like Lord Whitmore." Adrian's expression darkened slightly. "Worse." Music swelled upward from the ballroom below while couples rotated gracefully beneath crystal chandeliers. Serafina risked one glance downward. Hundreds of candles illuminated silk gowns and polished black coats moving across the marble floor like living shadows. Wealth. Power. Bloodlines stretching backward through centuries. None of it felt distant anymore. That frightened her most. Adrian followed her gaze toward the ballroom below. "You are shaking." Serafina immediately steadied the tray in her hands. "I am fine." "No," his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "You are overwhelmed." The honesty of the observation unsettled her more than criticism would have. Serafina looked away quickly. "I do not belong here." Silence answered first. Then Adrian said quietly, "That may not be true." Her pulse stumbled again. Before she could respond, movement below caught Adrian's attention instantly. His expression hardened. Serafina followed his gaze downward toward the ballroom entrance. Lord Whitmore had arrived downstairs accompanied by two older aristocratic men dressed in dark formal coats trimmed heavily with silver embroidery. One of them carried a cane carved with the same crescent and star symbol Serafina had seen inside the library documents. Cold spread through her body immediately. Adrian noticed. "Do not react," he said softly. "Too late." One of the older men downstairs had already looked upward toward the gallery. Directly at her. Even across the crowded ballroom, Serafina saw the exact moment recognition struck his face. The man stopped walking, completely still beneath the chandelier light. Lord Whitmore followed his gaze upward seconds later. Adrian stepped closer beside Serafina immediately. Too close for appearances. Protective without touching her. Dangerous in an entirely different way. "Listen to me carefully," he said quietly without looking away from the ballroom below. "You will leave the gallery now. Your Grace." Now. Serafina's breathing turned uneven. The older nobleman downstairs continued staring upward at her with growing disbelief. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted one shaking hand toward the crescent and star symbol carved into the head of his cane. Adrian saw it too. His jaw tightened. "Go," he said softly. "Before he remembers where he has seen your face." Serafina moved before fear could root her in place. She lowered the silver tray onto the nearest marble table with careful precision despite the violent rhythm of her pulse, then turned away from the gallery railing without looking downstairs again. Music continued rising from the ballroom beneath her. Violins. Laughter. Crystal glasses clinking softly beneath golden chandeliers. The sound no longer resembled celebration. It sounded like danger hidden behind beautiful things. She crossed the upper corridor quickly while Adrian remained at the gallery edge facing the nobleman below. Serafina did not look back until she reached the shadowed staircase leading toward the east wing. When she finally glanced upward again, Adrian Blackthorne stood motionless above the ballroom like a wall placed deliberately between her and the rest of the world. Lord Whitmore and the older aristocrat still watched the gallery from below, but now their attention rested entirely on the Duke. Serafina disappeared into the darkened corridor beyond before anyone else noticed her leave. Her breathing remained uneven all the way back toward the east wing. Questions collided violently inside her mind with every step. Who was the older man downstairs? Why had recognition flashed across his face so quickly? And why did Adrian look more prepared than surprised? By the time she reached the iron gates separating the east wing from the rest of the manor, her hands had begun trembling badly enough that she nearly dropped the ring of brass keys while unlocking them. The corridor beyond stood silent and dim beneath low candlelight. Safe. Or at least safer than the ballroom downstairs. Serafina closed the gates behind her quickly and leaned against the cold iron bars for one brief moment with her eyes shut. Her chest tightened painfully. The Ashcombe child disappeared on March 9, 23 years ago. The sentence would not leave her alone now. Neither would the sketch inside the library, or the matching pendants, or the way Adrian Blackthorne looked at her whenever he thought too much truth might already be visible in her face. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the eastern corridor. Serafina straightened immediately. Nathaniel Harrow appeared moments later carrying a lantern in one hand and several folded papers beneath the other arm. Relief crossed his face the instant he saw her. Thank God. Serafina swallowed unevenly. What is happening downstairs? Nathaniel glanced back toward the locked gates before lowering his voice. Lord Whitmore brought Lord Carrington with him tonight. The older man with the cane. Nathaniel nodded once. He was a close ally of the Ashcombes before the fire. Cold settled deeper inside her chest. He recognized me. Possibly. Do not soften it. Serafina's voice sharpened before she could stop herself. He looked at me like someone seeing a ghost. Nathaniel's expression remained grim beneath the lantern glow. Then Adrian was right. About what? Silence followed too long. Serafina stepped closer instinctively. Nathaniel. He exhaled quietly before answering. About time running out. The corridor seemed to narrow around her. You already knew. Some of it. How much? Nathaniel looked genuinely tired suddenly. Enough to understand why Adrian kept the east wing closed all these years. Serafina stared at him. What does that mean? Another pause. Careful this time. Measured. There were rumors after the Ashcombe fire, he said quietly. Whispers that the infant daughter survived. And Adrian believed them. Nathaniel's eyes lifted toward the dark corridor behind her. No, his answer came softly. Absolutely. Adrian knew. The word struck harder than fear itself. Serafina took a small step backward. No, Serafina. No, her breathing turned shallow. If he knew, then why say nothing? Nathaniel hesitated visibly now. That hesitation terrified her more than the answer itself. Because people died after the fire, he said quietly. Not immediately. Quietly. Years later. Anyone connected to the Ashcombes began disappearing from society one piece at a time. Serafina felt the blood drain slowly from her face. You are saying someone hunted them. Nathaniel lowered his voice further. I am saying Adrian Blackthorne spent 12 years making certain nobody connected your face to that family. Silence collapsed heavily between them. Serafina stared past him toward the locked iron gates leading back toward the ballroom and the glittering world below. Every strange thing suddenly rearranged itself differently inside her mind. The East Wing. The hidden portrait. The reassignment. The gloves. The warnings. Not coincidence. Never coincidence. He kept me here. The realization escaped quietly. Nathaniel did not deny it. He protected you. Serafina looked at him sharply. By turning me into a servant? By keeping you alive? The corridor fell silent again except for distant music drifting faintly upward through the manor floors below. Serafina wrapped both arms tightly around herself despite the warmth of the east wing. My mother knew. Nathaniel nodded once. Most likely. Then why never tell me? Perhaps because she understood what Adrian did. Serafina laughed once softly. The sound held no humor at all. You both speak about my life as though it belonged to someone else. Nathaniel's face tightened slightly. You are angry. Should I not be? Before he could answer, the sound of the east wing gates unlocking echoed sharply through the corridor behind him. Both of them turned immediately. Adrian Blackthorne stepped through the iron entrance alone. His formal black coat remained immaculate despite the chaos now burning quietly beneath the surface of the evening. The gates closed behind him with heavy finality. Nathaniel straightened immediately. Adrian's gray eyes moved first toward Serafina, then toward Nathaniel. Leave us. Nathaniel hesitated only briefly before nodding once and disappearing silently down the corridor. Serafina remained standing motionless beneath the candlelight while Adrian approached slowly across the polished oak floor. Neither spoke at first. The distance between them felt heavier now, filled with too many truths. Adrian stopped several feet away from her. Lord Carrington remembers your mother. Serafina's throat tightened painfully. You knew he would. Adrian's silence confirmed it. Something inside her finally cracked. You knew, she whispered. From the beginning. The Duke did not deny it. Serafina felt anger rise so suddenly it frightened her. You let me scrub floors in this house while knowing who I was. Adrian's jaw tightened. You were safe here. Safe. Her voice shook now despite every effort to control it. You watched me live like a servant. I watched you stay alive. The answer came harder this time. Sharper. For the first time since she met him, Adrian Blackthorne sounded dangerously close to losing control. Serafina stared at him, breathing unevenly. Who am I? Adrian held her gaze steadily. Your name was Serafina Ashcombe. The corridor disappeared around her. Not physically. Worse than that. The world remained exactly where it was while everything inside her shifted violently out of place. Ashcombe. The name echoed through her chest like something remembered rather than learned. Serafina shook her head immediately. No, yes. You cannot simply hand someone a different life and expect them to believe it. Adrian stepped closer then. Not cold now. Not distant. Intense in a way she had never seen before. I did not choose this for you. But you hid it. Silence answered. Too honest to deny. Serafina felt sudden tears burn painfully behind her eyes. She hated them instantly. 12 years, she whispered. You knew for 12 years. Adrian's expression shifted then. Something exhausted moved beneath all the control at last. I was 22 years old when they brought you to Blackthorne Manor. Serafina stopped breathing. What? You were sick. Half frozen. Too young to understand what happened to your family. His voice lowered further. Your mother begged me not to let them find you. Serafina stared at him, unable to move. Adrian looked away briefly toward the dark windows lining the corridor. I promised her I would protect you. The anger inside her faltered unexpectedly. My mother came here? Once. And you never told me. Adrian's eyes returned slowly to hers. Because the less you knew, the longer you survived. Silence spread between them again. Heavy. Fractured. Serafina realized suddenly that Adrian looked tired. Not physically. Deeply tired. Like a man who had spent years carrying something too heavy alone. That realization frightened her almost as much as the truth itself. Who killed them? She asked softly. Adrian's face became unreadable again immediately. That, he said quietly, is the one thing you are not ready to know. The East Wing remained silent long after the music downstairs finally ended. Near midnight, the last guests departed Blackthorne Manor beneath cold starlight while servants extinguished candles one floor at a time throughout the estate. Yet sleep never reached the eastern corridors. Serafina sat alone beside the library fireplace wrapped in a dark wool blanket Mrs. Whitmore had quietly brought her an hour earlier without explanation. The flames burned low now, throwing soft amber light across shelves of leather-bound books and polished oak walls. Everything around her still felt unreal. Serafina Ashcombe. The name moved through her thoughts like something half-remembered from a forgotten dream. She tried saying it silently to herself several times. It never sounded like hers. Adrian had left shortly after their conversation ended. Duty called him back downstairs to his guests while Serafina remained inside the east wing surrounded by fragments of another life, hidden carefully for years behind locked doors and quiet lies. Lies told gently enough to resemble protection. That was the worst part. If Adrian Blackthorne had been cruel, hatred would have come easily. Instead, he had spent 12 years building walls around her existence with terrifying precision. Protecting her. Controlling her. Erasing her. A soft knock interrupted the silence near 1 o'clock. Serafina straightened immediately. "Come in," she said quietly. Nathaniel Harrow entered carrying a silver tray with tea and untouched slices of bread arranged neatly beneath linen cloth. He paused near the doorway when he saw her sitting beside the fireplace. "You should eat something." Serafina looked back toward the flames. "I am not hungry." Nathaniel crossed the room anyway and placed the tray carefully onto the low table beside her chair. "That has never stopped Mrs. Whitmore before." A faint exhausted smile almost touched Serafina's mouth before fading again. Nathaniel studied her quietly for several seconds. "He should have told you sooner." Serafina's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket wrapped across her lap. "Would it have changed anything?" Nathaniel did not answer immediately. "Possibly." "No," she shook her head slowly. "People like Adrian Blackthorne do not keep secrets accidentally." The secretary lowered himself carefully into the chair opposite hers. Firelight softened the sharp edges of his expression. "You think he manipulated your entire life?" Serafina stared into the flames. "Did he not?" Silence settled between them. Nathaniel finally exhaled quietly. When Adrian was 22, he was not yet Duke. His father had only recently died. The estate was drowning in debt. Parliament watched every decision he made. Serafina remained still. Nathaniel continued carefully. Then one winter night, a terrified woman arrived at Blackthorne Manor carrying a half-frozen child. Serafina's breathing slowed. "My mother." "Yes." Firelight reflected softly across Nathaniel's eyes now. "Catherine Vale knew people were searching for you. She believed your family had been betrayed from inside aristocratic society itself." Serafina looked toward him sharply. "Betrayed by who?" Nathaniel hesitated. "Adrian never told me everything." "But he knows." "Yes." The single word landed heavily in the room. Nathaniel leaned back slowly against the chair. "Your mother begged him to hide you. Permanently if necessary." Serafina lowered her eyes toward the untouched tea tray. "So he turned me into a servant." No, Nathaniel's voice softened unexpectedly. "He turned you invisible." The truth inside the sentence hurt more because part of her already understood it. Servants disappeared in plain sight every day. Nobody memorized their faces. Nobody questioned their histories. Aristocrats looked through them rather than at them. Perfect hiding place. Perfect prison. "Did my mother stay here?" Serafina asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. "Only long enough to know you were safe." "Why did she leave?" Another pause. "Because if people discovered she survived, they would have followed her back to you." Serafina closed her eyes briefly. Every answer only created new grief. Nathaniel stood slowly a moment later. "You should rest." "I do not think I can." He looked toward the library windows where moonlight silvered the dark glass. "Neither can Adrian." Before Serafina could respond, movement outside the partially open library door caught both their attention. Adrian stood quietly in the corridor shadows beyond the threshold. He had removed his formal evening coat. The top button of his white shirt hung undone beneath the dark waistcoat, as though exhaustion had finally loosened something in him after the guests departed. Nathaniel rose immediately. "Your Grace." Adrian nodded once without looking away from Serafina. "Leave us." Nathaniel disappeared silently from the room moments later. Adrian entered only after the door closed behind him. The library suddenly felt smaller than before. More intimate. More dangerous. Serafina remained seated beside the fireplace while Adrian crossed slowly toward the far bookshelf. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter resting nearby before speaking. "You should sleep." Serafina laughed softly without humor. "After discovering my entire life belonged to someone else?" Adrian looked down at the amber liquid inside his glass. It belonged to you. I only changed the name attached to it. That is not a small thing. Silence followed. Adrian finally sat across from her in the chair Nathaniel had vacated moments earlier. Firelight moved softly across his face now. Without the ballroom guests and polished controls surrounding him, he looked strangely human tonight. Older somehow. You hate me, he said quietly. Serafina stared at him across the fire. I do not know what I feel. Adrian accepted that answer with a slight nod. Fair. The calmness in his voice unsettled her again. Why are you so calm? She asked suddenly. His eyes lifted toward hers. I am not calm. Serafina searched his face carefully then. For the first time since meeting him, she noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath the discipline, the dark shadows beneath his eyes, the way one hand remained clenched loosely around the whiskey glass as though holding control physically in place. Adrian Blackthorne looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could no longer contain. Lord Carrington recognized you tonight, he said after several seconds. That means others eventually will as well. Serafina wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. What happens then? Adrian's gaze shifted toward the fire. That depends on who reaches you first. Cold spread slowly through her chest. You speak as though I am still in danger. You are. From who? Adrian's jaw tightened. There are families who benefited from the Ashcombe collapse. You mean they stole from us? Silence answered. Enough silence to confirm it. Serafina stared at him in disbelief. And no one stopped them? Adrian laughed once quietly, bitter enough to surprise her. This world protects power, Serafina, not innocence. The fire cracked sharply between them. Outside, wind moved softly against the windows overlooking the northern gardens. Serafina looked toward him again after a long silence. Did you know my parents well? Adrian went very still. Too still. Yes. Were you friends? Another pause. Your mother trusted me. Something in the answer felt incomplete. Serafina noticed it immediately. But Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the whiskey glass. Your father did not. Why? The Duke looked away toward the fire before answering. Because he believed I would eventually become dangerous. Serafina frowned faintly. Was he wrong? Adrian met her gaze fully then. Firelight reflected inside his gray eyes with unsettling intensity. No, silence settled heavily across the room once more. Serafina realized suddenly that she was no longer afraid of Adrian in the ordinary sense. Fear had transformed into something far more complicated. Because every terrifying thing he had done to her life had also kept her alive long enough to discover the truth. She hated that part most of all. Adrian leaned forward slightly then and reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat. He withdrew a folded piece of paper yellowed carefully with age. Your mother wrote this before she left Blackthorne Manor. Serafina stopped breathing. Adrian held the letter toward her without moving closer. I never intended to give it to you. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingers. At the bottom corner rested a familiar crescent and star symbol drawn carefully in faded ink. Serafina unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting inside looked elegant and steady despite its age. My sweetest girl, if you are reading this, then Adrian has finally failed to keep the truth from you. Serafina's pulse stumbled painfully. She looked up immediately. Adrian remained motionless across the fire, watching her with unreadable eyes. You read this? It was not a question. Yes. For years. Adrian said nothing. Serafina looked back toward the letter again. Trust him when it matters most. The next line blurred slightly as tears burned behind her eyes. He promised me you would survive, and he is the only man powerful enough to make such a promise mean something. Serafina lowered the paper slowly into her lap. The room felt unbearably quiet now. Adrian looked toward the fire rather than at her. Your mother understood exactly what kind of man I was, he said softly. She trusted me anyway. Serafina stared at him through the flickering firelight, while the letter trembled faintly between her fingers. And for the first time since learning the truth, she realized something far more frightening than hidden bloodlines or forgotten names. Adrian Blackthorne had never once doubted who she was. Not for a single day. Morning arrived pale and cold across Blackthorn Manor. Frost silvered the northern gardens beyond the east wing windows while thin winter sunlight stretched across the library floor in long quiet lines. Seraphina had not slept. The letter from her mother remained folded carefully beside her untouched teacup long after the fire burned low, and the rest of the manor settled into silence. Trust him when it matters most. The sentence refused to leave her alone. She hated that part of herself wanted to obey it. Shortly after dawn, servants resumed moving through the manor corridors carrying coal, fresh linens, and breakfast trays while distant voices drifted upward from the lower kitchens. Life continued. The realization felt almost cruel. Somewhere beneath the same roof where noble families once erased her existence, maids still scrubbed floors and polished silver exactly as they had yesterday. Only Seraphina herself had changed. Or perhaps not changed. Revealed. That distinction frightened her more. A soft knock interrupted the silence near 8 o'clock. Before Seraphina could answer, Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a dark blue coat folded across one arm. The housekeeper's sharp eyes immediately noticed the untouched food tray and sleepless shadows beneath Seraphina's eyes. She said nothing about either. His Grace requests your presence downstairs at 10 o'clock. Seraphina looked up slowly from the library chair. Downstairs where? The western drawing room. Mrs. Whitmore placed the coat carefully across the nearest armchair. Several guests remained overnight. Unease moved immediately through Seraphina's chest. Lord Carrington? Yes. Mrs. Whitmore adjusted one sleeve calmly. Along with Lady Beaumont and Lord Whitmore. Seraphina tightened her fingers unconsciously against the edge of the blanket, wrapped around her lap. Why? The older woman's expression revealed nothing. His Grace did not explain. That answer meant Adrian absolutely had explained. Just not to her. Mrs. Whitmore glanced briefly toward the folded letter beside the tea tray. Something softened almost invisibly behind her severe expression before disappearing again. You should eat something before 10. Then she turned toward the door. Mrs. Whitmore. The older woman paused. Seraphina hesitated before speaking quietly. Did you know? Silence filled the room for several seconds. About who I was. Mrs. Whitmore finally looked back toward her. I knew who you needed to survive as. Then she left. At exactly 10 o'clock, Seraphina descended the eastern staircase wearing the dark blue coat Mrs. Whitmore provided over a plain cream dress unfamiliar enough to feel dangerous against her skin. Not servant gray. Not noble silk. Something between worlds. The west drawing room waited beyond the main corridor overlooking the southern gardens where pale sunlight reflected sharply across frost-covered hedges and frozen fountains. 2 footmen opened the doors silently as she approached. Conversation inside stopped immediately. Seraphina entered slowly. Lord Whitmore stood near the fireplace beside Lady Beaumont while the older nobleman from the previous evening occupied a leather armchair near the windows, his carved cane resting across both hands. Adrian Blackthorn stood beside the mantel dressed in dark charcoal formal wear, one hand behind his back exactly as always. Yet today the room belonged to him differently. Not socially. Strategically. As though every person present understood he controlled whatever happened next. Lord Carrington rose slowly the moment Seraphina entered. His aged face tightened visibly while his sharp blue-gray eyes studied her with something deeper than curiosity now. Memory. Good God, he whispered softly. Seraphina stopped near the doorway. Adrian's voice remained calm. Miss Vale. Lord Carrington looked toward him sharply. You still call her that? Adrian's expression did not change. It has been her name for 23 years. Silence settled heavily through the drawing room. Lady Beaumont studied Seraphina openly now without bothering to disguise it. The resemblance is extraordinary, she murmured quietly. Lord Whitmore remained colder, more careful. Resemblance proves nothing. Adrian finally looked toward him. No. But the crest does. Seraphina felt the room tighten instantly. Lord Carrington stepped closer slowly. May I see your wrist, child? Child. The word struck unexpectedly deep. Seraphina hesitated instinctively before Adrian spoke quietly from across the room. It is your decision. The choice startled her. After so many years of hidden truths and controlled silence, the simple permission unsettled her more than command would have. Slowly, Serafina removed the right glove and pulled back the sleeve just enough to reveal the crescent and star birthmark against pale skin. Lord Carrington stopped breathing. Lady Beaumont lowered her eyes briefly. Even Lord Whitmore's expression hardened with unmistakable recognition. Silence followed, heavy enough to hear the fire crack softly behind them. Lord Carrington's voice trembled when he finally spoke. Evelyn had the same mark. Serafina pulled the sleeve back down immediately. Adrian stepped forward then. Subtle. Protective. The movement did not escape anyone in the room. Lady Beaumont noticed first. Her gaze shifted slowly between them. How long have you known? Adrian answered without hesitation. Since she arrived at Blackthorn Manor. Lord Whitmore's expression darkened instantly. You concealed an Ashcombe heir for 12 years without informing the Crown. I concealed a child from people who benefited from her family's destruction. Adrian's voice cooled another degree. There is a difference. Lord Whitmore took one sharp step forward. Careful. Adrian met his gaze evenly. Always. The tension inside the room sharpened immediately. Serafina stood frozen near the doorway watching generations of aristocratic power move silently beneath polished words and controlled expressions. This was not merely about her identity. It never had been. It was about inheritance. Alliances. Old betrayals still alive beneath wealth and titles. Lord Carrington looked toward Adrian again after a long silence. Does she know everything? Adrian answered quietly. Not yet. Then perhaps it is time. Serafina's pulse quickened. Time for what? No one answered immediately. Lady Beaumont crossed slowly toward the window overlooking the frost-covered gardens outside. 23 years ago, she said softly, the Ashcombes possess one of the largest private estates in northern England. Land, trade routes, political influence. Her gaze shifted back toward Serafina. When the estate burned, every surrounding noble family profited from its collapse. Lord Whitmore's jaw tightened visibly. That is speculation. No, Adrian said calmly. It is accounting. Silence struck the room again. Serafina stared toward him. Adrian remained perfectly still beside the fireplace, but something colder moved beneath the calm now. Controlled anger. Old enough to feel permanent. Lord Carrington lowered himself slowly back into the armchair. Your father believed the fire was arranged. Serafina looked toward him sharply. Arranged by who? Another pause. Careful this time. Dangerous. Lord Carrington's weathered eyes shifted briefly toward Lord Whitmore before returning to Serafina. By men powerful enough to survive suspicion. Lord Whitmore's expression hardened completely. You tread close to slander. Adrian's voice cut through the room before Carrington could answer. No one here is interested in legal language anymore. The fire cracked sharply between them. Lady Beaumont turned slowly from the windows. If Serafina Ashcombe lives publicly again, every estate transaction connected to the Ashcombe collapse may face investigation. Serafina finally understood. Not completely. Enough. Her existence threatened people. Wealth. Power. Entire noble families built upon the assumption she died 23 years earlier. Lord Whitmore looked directly at Adrian then. And what exactly are you planning to do now? Silence followed. Adrian's gray eyes moved briefly toward Serafina. Not cold. Not distant. Decided. What I promised her mother, he said quietly. I will restore what was stolen. The room stopped breathing. Even Serafina felt it. Because Adrian Blackthorn had not spoken like a duke protecting a servant. He had spoken like a man declaring war. News traveled through London before sunset. By evening, invitations that normally required weeks of negotiation changed hands within hours as aristocratic households scrambled to confirm attendance at the royal winter reception hosted inside Halverston Palace 3 nights later. Nobody announced the reason publicly. Nobody needed to. An Ashcombe heir lived. The rumor moved through noble society like fire beneath silk. Quiet at first. Then unstoppable. Blackthorn Manor transformed with frightening speed after that. Messengers arrived at all hours carrying sealed documents, property records, and legal correspondence from London. Nathaniel Harrow barely slept. Mrs. Whitmore dismissed half the regular servant staff from the East Wing entirely and replaced them with older employees loyal only to Adrian Blackthorn. Even the guards stationed outside the northern gates doubled overnight. Serafina noticed everything. Nobody explained anything. That frightened her more. By the second evening after the drawing room confrontation, the east wing no longer resembled a hidden corner of the estate. It resembled preparation for battle. Serafina stood near the library windows watching snow begin drifting across the northern gardens, while Adrian reviewed documents at the long oak table behind her. The room smelled faintly of ink, cedarwood, and the low fire burning steadily beside the shelves. Outside, winter had finally arrived. "You should sit down," Adrian said quietly without looking up from the papers. Serafina remained near the window. "You have said almost nothing for 2 days." Adrian signed another document carefully before setting the pen aside. "I have been occupied." "No," she turned toward him finally. "You have been avoiding me." Silence followed. Adrian lifted his eyes toward her slowly. "That was not my intention." "Then what was?" The Duke leaned back slightly in the chair. Firelight moved across the hard lines of his face. Controlled as always. Yet exhaustion shadowed him more visibly now. "Every conversation we have changes your life further," he said quietly. "I thought perhaps you deserved a few hours without another truth destroying something." The honesty of the answer unsettled her immediately. Serafina crossed her arms tightly against herself. "And now?" Adrian looked toward the documents spread across the table between them. "Now there is no time left." A sharp knock interrupted the room before she could answer. Nathaniel entered moments later carrying a folded letter sealed with dark green wax. His expression alone changed the air instantly. It arrived from the palace. Adrian stood immediately. Nathaniel handed him the letter in silence. Serafina watched the Duke break the seal and unfold the paper carefully beneath the firelight. His face revealed nothing while reading. That frightened her more than anger would have. "Well?" Nathaniel asked quietly after several seconds. Adrian lowered the letter slowly. "The Crown requests formal confirmation." Cold moved through the room. Serafina stepped closer instinctively. "Confirmation of what?" Adrian's gray eyes lifted toward hers. "Your identity." Silence settled heavily across the library. Nathaniel exhaled quietly beside the doorway. They moved faster than expected. "Lord Whitmore," Adrian said calmly. He forced the issue. Serafina's pulse quickened unevenly. "What happens now?" Adrian folded the letter carefully before placing it atop the oak table. 3 nights from now, the royal court will host a formal winter reception. And Adrian held her gaze steadily. "You will attend." The room seemed to stop breathing. Serafina stared at him, unable to speak at first. No, Adrian's expression did not change. "Yes. I cannot walk into a royal reception." "You can." "As what?" The question escaped sharper than intended. "A servant." Silence answered. Then Adrian crossed slowly around the table toward her. "As Serafina Ashcombe." Her chest tightened painfully. "I do not know how to be that person." Adrian stopped only a few feet away. "Neither does anyone else." The answer stunned her into silence. Nathaniel looked between them carefully before stepping back toward the door. "I will prepare the London arrangements." Adrian nodded once without taking his eyes from Serafina. The secretary disappeared quietly moments later, leaving the library heavy with silence once more. Snow drifted softly against the windows outside. Serafina wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "You speak as though this is simple." "No," Adrian's voice lowered slightly. "I speak as though it is necessary." "Necessary for who?" Something shifted behind his eyes then. "Brief. Dangerous. For you." Serafina shook her head immediately. "You do not understand." Adrian's jaw tightened faintly. "Then explain it to me." She looked away toward the falling snow outside the windows. "I spent 14 months scrubbing floors in this house while noble guests walked past me without seeing my face. I do not suddenly become one of them because of a name." Adrian moved closer. Quietly enough that she did not notice until his voice sounded directly beside her. "You were always one of them." "No," Serafina turned sharply toward him. "That is exactly the problem. You still think blood matters more than life." Silence followed. Adrian accepted the words without anger. That somehow made them heavier. "You believe I care only because you are an Ashcombe." Serafina hesitated. Do you not? Adrian looked at her for one long moment. Then slowly, very slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his dark waistcoat and withdrew something folded carefully with age. Another sketch. He handed it toward her without speaking. Serafina accepted it cautiously. Her breath caught the instant she unfolded the paper. A young girl stared back from the charcoal sketch. 6 years old perhaps. Pale hair loose around a small solemn face. Gray-blue eyes. The resemblance to herself remained unmistakable even at that age. Serafina's pulse stumbled. Who drew this? Adrian's answer came softly. I did. She looked up immediately. Adrian remained motionless beside the window. Snowlight silvered the edges of his dark hair and sharpened the exhaustion beneath his eyes. You remember me. It was not truly a question anymore. Adrian nodded once. More than you know. Serafina stared down at the sketch again. I do not remember you at all. Something almost painful crossed his expression before disappearing beneath control again. You were very young. But you remembered anyway. Adrian looked toward the fire rather than at her. Some things do not leave a man. Silence filled the room again. Different this time. Colder. More dangerous. Because Serafina suddenly realized Adrian Blackthorne had not protected an abstract heir, hidden somewhere inside his estate. He had protected her specifically. Her face. Her voice. Her existence. For 12 years. Why? She whispered quietly. Adrian closed his eyes briefly before answering. Because the night your mother brought you here, you looked at me and asked whether monsters were real. Serafina stopped breathing. Adrian's voice remained low, controlled only by effort now. I told you no. He finally looked back at her then. Storm gray eyes stripped painfully bare beneath the firelight. I have been trying to keep that promise ever since. The library fell completely silent. Snow drifted steadily beyond the windows while the fire cracked softly between them. Serafina stared at him, unable to move. Because nothing in Adrian's face resembled duty anymore. Or obligation. Or noble responsibility. It looked far more dangerous than that. It looked personal. Very slowly, Adrian stepped closer and held out his hand toward her. 3 nights from now, he said quietly, every noble house in England will watch what happens inside that ballroom. Serafina's pulse thundered unevenly. Adrian's hand remained extended between them. Steady. Certain. And if I refuse? She asked softly. Adrian's expression did not change. Then I will still protect you. The answer shattered something inside her more completely than any confession could have. Because he meant it. No matter who she chose to become. No matter whether she reclaimed the Ashcombe name or buried it forever. Adrian Blackthorne would still stand between her and anyone who threatened her existence. Serafina looked down at the hand waiting silently before her. Then with trembling fingers she placed hers inside it. Adrian's hand closed around hers immediately. Warm. Steady. Possessive in a way neither of them acknowledged aloud. What happens at the reception? She whispered. Adrian's gaze never left her face. I end 12 years of silence. Snow covered London by the evening of the royal winter reception. Carriages lined the palace entrance in endless rows beneath torchlight while noble families stepped carefully across fresh white snow into the enormous marble halls of Halverston Palace. Music drifted through the open archways above the grand staircase where servants in royal livery guided guests toward the ballroom glowing beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Everywhere, voices lowered when certain names appeared in conversation. Ashcombe. Blackthorne. Restoration. Scandal. By 8 o'clock, the entire court already sensed history moving quietly beneath the evening like a blade hidden beneath silk. Serafina stood motionless inside the private receiving chamber assigned to Blackthorne House while Mrs. Whitmore adjusted the final fastening at the back of her gown with precise silent movements. The dress itself remained deceptively simple compared to the elaborate jewels and heavy embroidery worn by most noblewomen downstairs. Ivory silk. Long fitted sleeves. Soft silver detailing near the collar and waist. Elegant enough to command attention without appearing desperate for it. Adrian chose it personally. That knowledge unsettled her more than the dress itself. Mrs. Whitmore stepped back finally. Turn around. Serafina obeyed slowly. The older woman studied her for several seconds beneath the candlelight. No criticism came. That alone felt extraordinary. "The gloves remain," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "Until His Grace says otherwise." Serafina looked toward the long mirror standing beside the fireplace. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman reflected there. Pale gold hair arranged carefully away from her face. Gray-blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something far more dangerous beneath it now. Recognition, perhaps. Not acceptance. Not yet. But something had changed permanently since the night Adrian placed her mother's letter into her hands. A soft knock interrupted the room. Mrs. Whitmore crossed silently toward the door and opened it. Adrian Blackthorne entered dressed entirely in black formal evening attire trimmed only at the cuffs with silver embroidery carrying the Blackthorne crest. The room changed the moment he stepped inside. It always did. Mrs. Whitmore lowered her head respectfully before leaving without another word. The door closed behind her softly. Silence settled between them. Adrian looked at Serafina across the candlelit room without speaking at first. Not like a duke inspecting presentation. Like a man trying unsuccessfully to hide what seeing her did to him. Serafina felt her pulse shift unevenly beneath his gaze. Adrian crossed slowly toward her. "Are you frightened?" The honesty of the question startled her. "Yes." Adrian nodded once as though he expected nothing else. "Good." Serafina frowned faintly. "Good. People who are not frightened before entering rooms like this rarely understand what is waiting inside them." The answer carried enough bitterness to reveal memory beneath it. Adrian stopped beside the fireplace only a few feet from her. Firelight moved softly across the hard lines of his face. "Once we walk downstairs, everything changes." Serafina lowered her eyes briefly toward the ivory gloves covering her wrists. "You keep saying that." "Because it is true." Silence followed again. Heavy. Certain. Adrian finally stepped closer and reached toward her right hand slowly enough to allow refusal. Serafina did not pull away. His gloved fingers closed gently around hers. Warm even through the silk. "Listen carefully," he said quietly. "There are people downstairs who spent 23 years believing your family vanished permanently. Tonight threatens fortunes built upon that belief." Serafina looked up toward him. "And if they try to deny who I am?" Adrian's expression did not change. "Then they deny me publicly as well." The words settled heavily between them. Serafina suddenly understood something she had avoided fully acknowledging until now. Adrian Blackthorne had attached his name and power entirely to hers already. If she fell publicly tonight, he would fall beside her. "Why would you risk that?" she whispered softly. Adrian held her gaze steadily. "Because some promises are worth destroying kingdoms to keep." Before she could answer, another knock sounded sharply beyond the door. Nathaniel entered carrying a sealed velvet case in both hands. His usually calm expression looked almost tense tonight. "It is time." Adrian released Serafina's hand immediately. Nathaniel crossed toward them and opened the velvet case carefully atop the nearby table. Inside rested a diamond and sapphire necklace surrounding the same crescent and star crest Serafina had seen hidden throughout the east wing. Her breath caught softly. "That belonged to Evelyn Ashcombe," Nathaniel said quietly. Adrian reached into the case himself and lifted the necklace carefully beneath the candlelight. For one brief moment, something unguarded crossed his face while looking at it. Grief perhaps. Or memory. Then the control returned. He stepped behind Serafina slowly. "Lift your hair." Her hands trembled slightly as she obeyed. Adrian fastened the necklace carefully against the back of her neck. His fingers brushed once against her skin near the clasp. Barely a touch. Enough to stop her breathing all the same. "There," he said quietly behind her. Serafina looked toward the mirror again. The Ashcombe crest rested openly now against ivory silk and pale skin beneath the candlelight. Hidden no longer. Adrian met her eyes through the reflection. "Once we enter the ballroom, there is no returning to anonymity." Serafina swallowed slowly. "I know." Yet the fear inside her had changed shape. It no longer felt like fear of noble society. It felt like standing on the edge of becoming someone irreversible. Music drifted faintly upward from the royal ballroom below as Adrian offered his arm toward her. Formal. Controlled. Yet beneath the discipline of the gesture, tension moved quietly between them like a second heartbeat. Serafina placed her gloved hand against his arm. Adrian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly at the contact before steadying again. Together, they stepped into the palace corridor. Servants bowed immediately as they passed. Noble guests lingering near the upper gallery turned to watch them cross toward the grand staircase. Whispers spread almost instantly ahead of them. By the time they reached the ballroom entrance, the atmosphere inside had already shifted. Hundreds of aristocrats filled the enormous royal hall beneath blazing crystal chandeliers and towering winter flower arrangements draped in silver ribbon. Music played. Conversations flowed. Yet the moment Adrian Blackthorne entered beside Serafina, the ballroom began falling silent one section at a time. Not complete silence. Worse, controlled silence. Watching silence. Serafina felt every gaze in the room strike her at once. The necklace at her throat suddenly felt heavier than iron. Adrian guided her steadily forward across the polished marble floor without hesitation. Lords, ladies, diplomats, members of parliament. Every face turned toward them now. Shock moved visibly through the crowd as recognition spread from one noble family to another. Lady Beaumont stood near the central staircase, completely motionless beneath the chandelier light. Lord Carrington lowered his head slowly the instant he saw the Ashcombe crest resting against Serafina's throat. Lord Whitmore looked furious enough to crack stone. Adrian stopped at the center of the ballroom beneath the largest chandelier in the royal hall. The orchestra faltered uncertainly before falling silent entirely. Every eye remained fixed upon them. Serafina's pulse thundered painfully inside her chest. Then, before anyone could speak, Adrian Blackthorne did something no one inside the ballroom expected. He stepped away from her, turned fully toward her beneath the blazing crystal light, and slowly lowered himself onto one knee before the entire royal court. The ballroom stopped breathing. Serafina stared down at him, unable to move. Adrian lifted his gaze toward hers calmly despite the shock exploding silently around them. "Lady Serafina Ashcombe," he said clearly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "House Blackthorne formally recognizes your rightful bloodline before the crown tonight." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the chandelier seemed frozen above them. Adrian remained kneeling before her without lowering his eyes. The most powerful duke in England offering public recognition to the servant girl noble society, once ignored completely. Serafina felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. Not because of the title. Not because of the ballroom staring at her in stunned silence. Because Adrian Blackthorne had just placed his power publicly beneath her name. And everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. For one endless moment, nobody inside the royal ballroom moved at all. The orchestra remained frozen. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead like captured stars while hundreds of aristocrats stared toward the center of the marble floor where Adrian Blackthorne still knelt before Serafina Ashcombe beneath the gaze of the crown itself. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Lord Carrington stepped forward first. The elderly nobleman lowered his head deeply towards Serafina with visible emotion tightening his weathered face. "House Carrington recognizes the bloodline of Ashcombe," he said quietly. His voice carried farther than expected through the absolute silence. Another nobleman followed. Then another. One by one, members of the old aristocratic houses bowed their heads toward the woman they had ignored for years while she moved invisibly through servant corridors and polished marble halls. Serafina barely breathed through any of it. The world felt strangely distant now. Unreal beneath the chandelier light and whispered recognition spreading through the ballroom like a living thing. Adrian finally rose slowly to his feet before her. His gaze never left her face. "You should say something," he murmured quietly enough for only her to hear. Serafina looked around the ballroom helplessly. "I do not know how." Something almost gentle touched Adrian's expression then. "Yes," he said softly. "You do." The faith inside the answer steadied her more than reassurance could have. Serafina turned slowly toward the silent crowd surrounding them. Lords, ladies, ministers. Wealth powerful enough to destroy families with signatures and polite conversation. Yet now they waited for her to speak. Not the servant they once overlooked. Not the invisible girl scrubbing floors beneath their shoes. Serafina Ashcombe. She felt the weight of the name settle fully into place for the first time. Painfully. Permanently. Serafina lifted her chin slightly. I do not remember my family, she said quietly. The ballroom remained silent enough to hear every word. I do not remember estates or titles or what my life was supposed to become before the fire. Her fingers tightened briefly against the ivory silk of her gloves. But I remember what it means to be unseen. No one moved. For years, I stood in rooms like this while people spoke around me as though servants were furniture instead of human beings. Her gaze shifted slowly across the gathered aristocrats. Some of you were kind. Most of you never noticed whether kindness mattered. Lord Whitmore's expression hardened near the edge of the ballroom. Seraphina saw it. Continued anyway. I cannot become someone different simply because society now recognizes my name. Her voice softened slightly then. But I will not apologize for surviving long enough to reclaim it. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. Then somewhere near the grand staircase, Lady Beaumont lowered her head respectfully toward Seraphina. Others followed almost immediately afterward. The tension inside the ballroom shifted permanently after that. Recognition no longer felt reluctant. Felt inevitable. Adrian stood beside Seraphina through all of it without speaking once. Yet his presence beside her altered every glance and whisper moving through the royal court. Because everyone understood the same dangerous truth now. The Duke of Blackthorn had chosen his side completely. Hours later, the royal reception slowly dissolved back into music and conversation beneath glittering chandeliers, but nothing inside the ballroom resembled the earlier evening anymore. Conversations quieted when Seraphina passed. Noblewomen who once would have ignored her entirely now bowed politely. Men powerful enough to influence Parliament introduced themselves with careful respect. She should have felt victorious. Instead, Seraphina felt exhausted beyond words. Near midnight, she finally escaped onto the northern palace terrace, overlooking snow-covered gardens and frozen fountains below. Cold winter air struck her immediately after the suffocating warmth of the ballroom. Snow drifted softly across the dark London sky while distant music echoed faintly through the palace walls behind her. Seraphina wrapped her coat tighter around herself and closed her eyes briefly. You disappeared. Adrian's voice came quietly from behind her. Seraphina did not turn immediately. I needed silence. Footsteps crossed softly through snow behind her before stopping beside the terrace railing. Adrian stood nearby beneath the pale winter moonlight, still dressed entirely in black formal evening attire. Snowflakes settled lightly against his dark hair and shoulders before melting away. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt full. Adrian rested one gloved hand against the frozen stone railing overlooking the gardens below. You handled them well tonight. Seraphina laughed softly. I felt terrified. Most powerful people are. She turned toward him finally. You were not. Adrian's gray eyes lifted toward the falling snow. You are mistaken. The answer surprised her. Adrian remained quiet a moment longer before speaking again. When I walked into that ballroom tonight, I knew there was a possibility I could lose everything attached to the Blackthorn name. Seraphina stared at him. Yet you did it anyway. Adrian finally looked toward her. Moonlight silvered the sharp lines of his face. Some things matter more than power. The words settled carefully between them. Seraphina searched his expression for distance. For coldness. For the controlled duke who had terrified London society for years. She found only exhaustion and something infinitely more dangerous beneath it. Relief. You once asked me whether monsters were real, Adrian said quietly. Seraphina's pulse slowed unevenly. You remember that clearly. I remember everything about that night. Snow drifted softly between them now. Adrian stepped closer. Not as a duke approaching an heir. As a man crossing the final distance he had denied himself for years. When your mother brought you to Blackthorn Manor, you were wearing a blue coat 3 sizes too large. Seraphina blinked softly in surprise. Adrian's expression softened almost invisibly beneath the moonlight. You refused to let go of my hand even after you fell asleep. Something painful moved through her chest. I do not remember. I know. Adrian looked away briefly toward the frozen gardens below. That made it easier for you. And harder for you. The truth escaped before she could stop it. Adrian went still. Snow settled quietly across the terrace railing beside them. Yes, he admitted softly. Serafina stared at him. This man had spent 12 years protecting a child who eventually became a servant inside his own estate, because keeping her hidden mattered more than whether she hated him for it later. He had carried her name alone while the rest of the world believed she no longer existed. And tonight, before the entire crown, he placed his own power beneath her feet without hesitation. Not because she was useful, because she was hers. Adrian looked toward her again slowly. What are you thinking? Serafina swallowed once. That I spent years believing nobody ever truly saw me. Adrian's expression tightened faintly. Serafina. But you did. Silence followed, deep enough to hear the snow falling softly around them. Adrian stepped closer still. Near enough now that she could see the exhaustion hidden beneath his controlled expression. Near enough that the warmth of him reached her even through the cold winter air. From the first moment, he said quietly. Serafina's breath caught unevenly. Adrian lifted one gloved hand slowly toward her face, careful enough to stop if she wished. His fingers brushed lightly against a strand of pale hair loosened by the wind near her cheek. The touch barely lasted a second. It felt catastrophic all the same. You were never meant to kneel before people like them, Adrian said softly. His gray eyes held hers completely now. And I will spend the rest of my life making certain no one ever forces you to again. Tears burned suddenly behind Serafina's eyes. Not from sadness. From the terrifying realization that Adrian Blackthorne had become the only place in the world where she no longer felt invisible. Snow continued falling quietly across the palace gardens below, while music drifted faintly through distant ballroom windows behind them. Somewhere inside the royal court, noble society still whispered about bloodlines and power and the return of House Ashcombe. None of it mattered here. Serafina stepped closer until almost no distance remained between them at all. Adrian looked down at her with the same unbearable focus he carried from the beginning. Not the gaze of a duke studying an obligation. The gaze of a man who had already chosen her long before she knew her own name. Very slowly, Serafina placed her gloved hand against his chest over the steady heartbeat beneath black formal silk. Adrian closed his eyes briefly at the contact. Just once. Enough to reveal everything he never said aloud. When he opened them again, the cold, controlled Duke of Blackthorne was gone entirely. Only Adrian remained. And for the first time in her life, Serafina understood what it felt like to be seen completely and chosen anyway.